All right. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, as it may be, depending on your time zone. And welcome everybody to the March 28th meeting of the Gateway API Gamma project. As a reminder, Kubernetes Code of Conduct rules are in effect. So please treat each other respectfully. You can find the meeting notes in the event invite. I'll also drop the link in the chat again for anyone who needs it. It's an open agenda, so please feel free to add any topics that you're interested in discussing, and feel free to add your name to the attendees list so we can get an understanding of who's able to come to these events. As another reminder, they vary by time. They vary bi-weekly at the time. So this is the 8 a.m. Pacific time. This is intended to be friendly to and accessible for EU folks. And on alternate weeks, we swap back to 3 p.m. PST to be more accommodating to West Coast and extending over to Oceania. All right. With that, we can get into our recap of last week. I'll cover that briefly, and I'll start by sharing my screen. All right. So yeah, as a brief recap from last week, we celebrated getting the conformance testing plan get merged as provisional. Thank you, Mike, again for your work on getting that together. Really appreciate that. Oh, I guess that was a follow-up topic for that. Oh yeah, okay, John added that to the agenda. We'll get to that later, but we do have some progress on starting the actual implementation of that work, which I'm excited about. We also, Rob covered the Gateway API and MCS, so that's Multi-Cluster Services API. And that's a proposal it's a gap that's linked here. We definitely encourage folks to take a look at that. The intent is to kind of standardize how multi-cluster communications can happen, including within Gamma. So that's something that would definitely appreciate getting more eyes on, because getting implementation support for this functionality is definitely going to be a big part of making it successful. So we definitely encourage folks to check out Rob's GEP on MCS and Gateway API if you have not yet. And I guess the final thing that we started last week was a bit of a discussion around segmentation within a backend ref. I think that's a very early discussion, but if you have thoughts or preferences on that, feel free to check out the issue and the notes recording from last week if you're interested in that functionality. All right, I see Rob joined. If you want to, I can hand it over to you. I was going to cover it briefly, but if you want to talk about the Gateway API GA prioritization, would love to kind of cover that briefly here, and particularly as it pertains to Gamma.
Yeah, definitely. Would be happy to do that. Thanks for adding it to the agenda. That was definitely something like I'd meant to do. At a high level, what we're trying to do here is in the main Gateway API project, do everything we can to prioritize a 1.0 release in the next few months. And for us, 1.0 means GA for Gateway Class, Gateway, and HTTP Route. A real focus on centralized conformance reporting and other things that are really just about productionization. We have so many great implementations of the API. It really is more of a formality to market as GA now. I think these specific APIs are already quite stable. So what we're saying in this doc is that we really want, every new feature that we work on involves cost, and we want to be as focused as we possibly can over the next few months on anything that we need to do for GA and things that don't qualify under that will, just not have the same level of priority. With that said, this is really not meant to impact Gamma per se. Gamma is still very much a priority and something we consider a parallel effort. So not trying to delay Gamma in any way, but maybe in the same thought process, I think what Gamma is trying to do is similar in the sense of trying to do everything possible to, not expand the scope, but just get the scope that exists out. So again, that's very similar to what we're trying to do with the project as a whole. Happy to answer any questions on this, but high level, we really want to get GA release out soon, and anything we can do to help with that is very appreciated.
Thanks for covering that. Yeah, I'm excited about that, and I'm sure that all of our users of various Gateway API implementations will be very excited to have that happen too. All right, I don't see John in here yet. I don't know if Keith, you wanted to briefly cover the Gamma performance work that John had started, because I think that you had worked on it a bit too in the past.
Yeah, I can cover it. Give a brief summary here.
Cool.
So this PR is also very exciting, kind of following up from Mike Beaumont's work defining the testing plan. This PR actually starts implementing the conformance tests for Gamma. The approach is generally pretty basic, to just kubectl exec into a pod and send a request to another pod. The overall surface area of the changes isn't that great, but it's not great, but isn't that large. It's pretty much what you'd expect. But hang on one second, my headset is dying. Yeah, the surface area is not too large, but the big thing that I know John wanted to surface here is the fact that this PR kind of brings in the Istio app image for use as both the client and the server. This does kind of mark the new dependency of the Gateway API project on something external. We discussed this yesterday in the general Gateway API meeting, and there's some concern or general hesitation around where do these images live, where does the code for these images live, all these various things. So there's also the ongoing conversation of, okay, well, if we're going to have performance tests for gRPC route, that's probably going to introduce yet another image for conformance testing. The general consensus that I gathered from yesterday is that there's a desire to kind of collapse that into one dependency moving forward. But it was unclear if that's a blocker for this PR or if folks are comfortable following up here. So that is the gist of it. Does anybody have any questions or comments I'd like to add?
Yeah, I can just echo what I had said previously as well, is that I think somebody raised a very good comment in the meeting yesterday, which is that ideally tests and their dependencies are bundled together as part of a release, right? So we would love to control as much as possible as far as what it means to be conformant. And ideally that would include the images we're using to run the tests. I'm not entirely sure, I think we all kind of have the same end goal of, hey, can we have one image that covers all these capabilities in one place? I personally don't want to block on that. That is a good end goal, but at the most important thing today is that we have meaningful conformance tests. We can work on, a single image at some later point. I think a secondary goal would be also, even if we're fundamentally using the same base code as Istio. I would rather have some kind of control about how it's published, how, so that we're using a very specific version that we control. Those are just my guidelines. Yeah, Costin, you've got a good point. I don't know that we necessarily need just a single image. If there's enough overlap, I would like to simplify, if wherever possible. Right now what we're doing in our conformance test framework is we have a base set of infrastructure that we deploy for everything, and we try and reuse it for different test cases. So we're not, we don't have a very expensive test suite. I know it's already pretty long to run our conformance tests, but wherever we can share infrastructure, it does both simplify and speed up the test run. If we need a different image for, for gRPC, for mesh, and for ingress, that's just that much more infrastructure we need. Yeah, so that's all I've got on that. Those are just my thoughts, but obviously interested in others here too.
Sorry, Rob, I joined late because I was working on this PR, ironically. I only heard the last half of that. Were you suggesting, did you have a suggestion or just a concern?
Oh, yeah, sorry. The high level is I think an end goal where we can have as few images as possible is kind of,
Yeah,
a
I
good
totally
goal.
agree. I just wasn't sure of what people's opinions are on what those images should be, right?
Right. And I was not trying to block this PR on that. What
Yeah.
I do think is important is that we have some way of controlling, like I'd hate for an external dependency to somehow affect our conformance tests unexpectedly just because it changed and we weren't
Yeah.
aware, and from the external dependency part, you'd hate to unintentionally break something that you weren't testing whatever, right?
Yeah.
So even if it's effectively the same code base, if there's some way to, have a copy that's Gateway API specific, that feels like a reasonable starting point.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's good. I wanted someone to basically tell me what to do, because my default answer would be, just use the Istio one because I'm from Istio, so it's my bias. But yeah, that makes sense. In the short term, obviously we won't use the latest tag. We can pin it to something so it won't break from under us, and then we can also do other things longer term.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think you articulated my position on this like identically, so I don't think I have any more to add. But yeah, basically, we're definitely appreciative. I think this is a great idea to like jumpstart a conformance testing suite. So, and like no objections to the content of using this test runner. But yeah, it's just like longer term governance of it really. Cool.
Do we want like long term to use this one for ingress as well?
So that was my other point. If assuming that this is a superset, I haven't looked into this image much, but I'm assuming it includes an echo server that provides meaningful output.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar. Like it's basically, we use it to do every single test in Istio, so it has the kitchen sink of things accumulated.
Right.
There may be a few things that we don't have, but we can easily add them if we need, I would imagine. So
yeah, and so that seems like a thing that would be broadly useful. Because we have so much shared infrastructure and we're trying to not spin up, a new deployment, a new set of pods for every test case. If we can standardize on an image that maybe is a bit heavier weight, but includes all the things we might want to potentially test, that seems like a win, but I haven't looked into it that closely.
Cool. Thanks for covering that. Yeah, I'm excited for us to be able to start making progress on having real conformance tests. This is exciting. up next, Keith, do you want to share a bit about this parent ref clarification for Gamma? I can let you
Sure.
screen share, or I can pull the doc up.
Yeah, if you can click on it, that'd be great. So this GEP comes out of an issue from, I think it was our last Gamma meeting, where basically, we spent a little bit of time talking about the elephant in the room around service, and the fact that most people here agree that service is not the best long-term thing to bind to. But Kubernetes release cadence, as well as just the historical, the GA-ness of the service resource, is going to make it difficult to wait for anything from Kubernetes. So, actually, the greater context of that conversation was bringing up Gamma for Gateway API 0.7.0 review, similar to last time. And when we did this for 0.6.0, reviewers were hesitant about using service. So I wrote this GET to attempt to clarify how we, kind of the reasoning for service being used as a parent ref, as well as what other kinds of resources are usable for a parent ref. This gets into implementation specific, guidelines for implementation specific resources being used for parent ref, potentially unlocking some use cases. I had a series of thoughts that I've since edited down a bit since I think it was Saturday. It popped into my head, but wanted to get folks' opinions on this. The gist, the high level ideas here are that the parent ref is the front end of the lowercase s general service, and that if you want to, the resource that you use for parent ref is the matching mechanism for traffic from the producer route perspective. Does this route apply to my again lowercase s service? I also mentioned service import a bit in here to be more general. Linked to Rob's PR for multi-cluster service and in Gateway API, and it's listed under extended conformance. The kind of goal that I had for this was to try to kind of let reviewers know almost implicitly, like if we were going to have a resource in upstream Kubernetes to be able to bind with parent ref, this is what it would have to look like and fulfill. Spent some time talking with Mike, talking to John, and thinking about it myself. And as excited as I was for the IP address resource, the fact that it has a parent ref field that binds to service makes it a bit unwieldy from an implementation perspective, as well as a UX perspective. We know many people in Kubernetes who like to bring back the spreadsheets of IP addresses and what they correspond to. Something like a DNS resource would be, I think, more in the right direction. But that's a bit of a digression. But yeah, this doc is linked in the agenda notes. I'll link it to the issue that I created last week. But I'll take a big pause here and let folks ask questions or clarifications, or tell me I'm crazy. That's also welcome.
Cool. I haven't had a chance to read through the updated part about some implementation specific paragraphs, such as the potential for introducing egress functionality like that. I haven't gotten to that. But I think in general, I think this is really important to kind of clarify the front end role and what we need something to implement. And that kind of helps set the stage for being able to use this doc as a way to participate in any kind of upstream discussions about breaking up the service resource potentially. I think that's really kind of important for framing what do we need from it, and how the various some part, even if we don't want to bind into IP address the paragraph, I think it might be worth bringing back the mention of that, just in terms of what it fulfills, why not. And yeah, I think this is a great start though. So thank you for putting this together. And then I'll recognize Costin.
Yeah, just an idea. I mean, when it just came, should we just define some requirements that any resource that we bind to must have a spec and then IP address? So basically, more like an interface and requirements so that any implementation can bind to a resource as long as that resource has an IP in the spec. I don't know where's the service. We can have several options, so we can cover both service import if they have different fields. Because in reality, most meshes rely on some form of IP redirection interception. So what we need to, that's what we are doing. We are taking IP address is cluster IP or VIP, and we are doing something with that traffic if it matches.
Yeah, I think we have a mention of that in maybe get 1324. The like xroot binding one, I think maybe mentions like the role of the front end, and we could probably pull a line from that into here as well. I think that would be useful. John?
I meant to formalize it that you can bind to any resource whatsoever as long as the resource has an IP field in status with a particular name and definition. So basically, even if it's a foreign resource, if it is your whatever, service entry, foobar, whatever, any implementation will be able to look up that resource, load it, find the IP in some place, and then we'll know that it needs to apply. I don't know. Then we don't bind to service. We bind to anything that matches the interface of having a cluster IP or VIP or something in a specific place.
Gotcha. I that feels plausible. I would want to kind of like look at what are the implications of that, but it feels plausible at a first pass.
I think I have two kind of concerns.
Okay.
So one, to say that a parent has an IP address that is an implementation specific is fine. But to say that we're going to accept arbitrary types, like Istio will accept a console type without knowing about it, for example, because it kind of duck types it to have an IP address somewhere, I think is problematic. Controller, like Kubernetes is not well set up to read arbitrary resources that we don't know about ahead of time. But it's perfectly fine to say like Istio will define a type, it will have an IP address. Istio will support that as a parent ref, but I don't think we should expect other implementations to support those.
I was not expecting that either.
Yeah, I don't know if Costin was, but I kind of read through the lines there, but maybe that's not what was implied. The other thing is, I think IP address is at least a good start. It may not be the only front end attribute. Like you could imagine in like proxyless gRPC, for example, you don't actually match on any IP address, right? You match on a host name. So I'd be fine being more restrictive to begin with, but I would open up the possibility that it doesn't need an IP address. It just needs some notion of front end, which is probably an IP address or a DNS name. I don't know what else there could be, but I don't know, maybe a file path or a socket or something that's pretty obscure.
Sure, sure, that could be obscure, but yeah.
What do we say to don't want to open too much of a can of worms here, but a gateway seems to fit the criteria of a resource that is well known, that has an IP address, usually, that could be a parent, but I don't know what that looks like in mesh, but that's a question that does seem to come up fairly often of what is the future of gateway in Gamma, the gateway resource specifically.
I think it really blurs the line then between mesh and ingress, right? So I think if you made a cluster IP gateway type, there's absolutely no reason why we can't bind to that. Is it kind of confusing that sometimes it's this very kind of implicit thing, and sometimes I guess it's not even really that implicit. It's just like, where is it actually actuated? Like, do you have a dedicated load balancer instance per gateway, or is it kind of this meshy implicit thing? Which the spec totally leaves open. It's just today, traditionally, I think people think of one gateway means one load balancer, and it's this very concrete thing. So I think from at least my opinion, Gamma is perfectly suited for that. It may need some education on making users not be like, what the hell is going on? But it's perfectly suited for the model, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that reference to a cluster IP gateway is especially relevant since I know you and I think Dave are working on those, address scope related gaps right now, which would introduce the concept of essentially a cluster IP gateway. Maybe not exactly what you mean by cluster IP gateway, but it would be a gateway that served a cluster IP address, which starts to get especially blurry in how.
Well,
that
I think that,
relates.
I mean, it is close, yeah, but I think that's still more for like, at least in current implementations, provisioning a traditional ingress gateway. Whereas if we did like the whole fold on cluster IP gateway replacement for service, then it's like,
Yeah.
provision the DNS name, it's part of the mesh, there's no physical infrastructure for it. But it's definitely one step on the path there.
Yeah.
I think even just like with what kind of the scope of what you're currently talking about with the cluster IP gateways or like in cluster gateways, console has similar needs, whether it's for like transit gateways between clusters or like bridging to off cluster resources, things like that. Like egress gateways could be another way to implement this if you want your traffic flowing through a specific egress endpoint. So like there are definitely concrete gateway things that make sense for this model, even if it's like not introducing gateway as a concept to replace service.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think to me, one of the things that would be really helpful in this gap would be to clarify, if gateway doesn't make sense, which it seems like there's still some gaps here. Why doesn't it make sense, and what gaps need to be filled for gateway to be a meaningful parent ref? Because if I were just, as I was just kind of looking at this, it seems like, from a naive perspective, gateway meets the criteria that's been outlined here. And so maybe just to further refine this, so it's clear that gateway doesn't quite match yet today.
I have 2 points here. First of all, I want to make sure I responded to John. Maybe we need to update our doc. Maybe we need to make it more clear that an implementation is free to instantiate the gateway however it sees fit. I mean, it may be one gateway is one deployment resource, whatever, but it may be one multi-tenant shared gateway that is, or it can be one sidecar. Sidecar is actually a gateway. We run Envoy in Istio. Other people use similar heavy gateways next to the pod, but it's a valid implementation of a gateway. It's nothing specific as long as the APIs are and the tests are passing. And I will also mention that, for example, in JK is an internal load balancer. It's not really a gateway. It's a more like a mesh concept. Waypoint in Istio is also kind of is used for mesh, not for traditional ingress from the internet to pods. So we kind of already in implementation already blurred the lines, and we are using gateway objects to configure the mesh or configure internal traffic or things that are not ingress from the internet.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly fine. And the API model is really that you provision a gateway, you get an address and status, and you can call it to reach the gateway. It doesn't say that is one load balancer. And in the mesh case, that means we program every sidecar. I mean, in some mesh cases, we program every sidecar to actuate that, and it's like fully distributed. And that's perfectly fine. I think that if we start using gateway for mesh in that way, we'll just need to do a little bit of education for users, because I think some people may be confused by that, but I think that it is conceptually correct, and it's more of an education and documentation issue.
And users will be confused anyway when they see gateways used in Istio or in JK or in other places where they're actually internal objects that are only used internally for local traffic, and we call them gateway as well. So I think we especially if we are flexible in saying that it's the requirement has to have an IP address and gateway fits the bill, I think it will resolve most of the problems.
Yeah, I'm pretty interested to hear eventually from implementations like Linkerd, or those where the gateway might not be managed as part of the mesh, and you actually have to deal with two control planes. Like if you take the Istio case, then things get a bit simpler because you've got a single, you've got a single control plane, typically doing both jobs, and you can, in some tricky situations, you can cheat a bit because you've got the full context. This kind of falls into the next agenda item topic with that Mac and Flynn were working on as far as the gateway and mesh interactions. I'm personally, I'm all for using gateway as both a parent ref and a backend ref. I think it makes a lot of sense conceptually in my mind. I do think that when you're in a situation where your manifests, where X route manifests look identical from the gateway use case and the mesh use case, but they might behave differently implicitly, then you've got to just make sure you're really careful. So yeah, well, conceptually, I don't have any blockers. I do think there's some education to be done.
All right, so it feels like the action item here is kind of like what I tried to capture in the notes of, like adding a section to this doc about gateways as a parent ref, and what do we expect them to be used for? What do we not expect them to be used for yet? And if not, why not? And just kind of like get that part in writing, because it feels like a discussion that we've had come up several times. Yeah, I think just one of the things, just like configuration verbosity, I think is one of the immediate drawbacks of like people having existing services, service resources, and adding a new gateway resource to configure all of them on top of the HTTP route is just, it's one extra thing. It's not necessarily a deal breaker, but it is like a thing worth capturing. Yeah, I think there's a big conversation here about like what's the future of the service resource and how can we potentially split up that front end, and maybe a gateway is an answer to that. So yeah, looking forward to kind of seeing how this comes together.
Yeah, Mike, to your point on configuration verbosity, I know what I've done in the past when I've been met with similar issues is just kind of going through some example use cases and then doing like YAML snippets to compare and see, okay, how big of a difference is this? What would this look like to the user to kind of flush that out of it?
Yeah, no, I think getting example config would definitely be a big part of like proposing concrete API implementations. Is like, what does this look like to a user? Cool. Yeah. Now, thanks for all the thoughts and contributions on that topic. It feels like there's a lot there potentially. So definitely like, let's get some of that content into the doc, or leave comments or leave notes, or start Slack discussions if there's stuff that you would like to see covered as part of this topic. So I'll just briefly touch on, I'm working with Flynn on a GEP for routing across boundaries. So this started specifically on like the narrow scope of routing from a gateway to a mesh service and defining how that should happen. But I kind of expanded the scope a little bit to basically make sure that we have consistent and predictable behavior across different boundaries. So kind of the boundaries that I'm considering in the scope of this is gateway to mesh across namespaces. So potentially from a namespace with consumer routing rules to a namespace with producer routing rules, and across clusters as well. So like within a cluster set, and the final one here is something that's not part of any spec yet, but Consul does have some implementation for basically across the like cluster set boundary. So like addressing services that are imported where that assumption of sameness does not apply. So kind of at a high level, we would like to get once we get this document shape to be shared out, kind of the goal is going to be getting consensus on this is a UX that we would like to be configurable. Flynn and I share the opinion of it would be preferable for things to be mesh aware rather than routing directly to endpoints. There's some content that we need to add there in terms of like the difference between service discovery behavior and service mesh behavior in terms of user expectations. But there's also totally valid cases for routing to endpoints. And there's also, we want to explicitly enable single vendor implementations where like a single implementation owns both of the scopes to be able to collapse, merge, introduce efficiencies in terms of like how they make their routing decisions, whether that's like pre-computing, applying rules, and then routing to a specific endpoint or something like that. So we're working on this doc. We're not intending to propose a concrete API yet, just trying to get consensus on like, this is the thing that we would like to be configurable. And I don't think that we're going to propose a specific default. That's definitely going to be a point of trying to figure out where other meshes are at and kind of like if there is a common standard or if this is something that perhaps like leans itself towards introducing the oft debated mesh resource as as a potential place for a required one of kind of configuration to avoid bundling this onto HTTP root or backend ref or anything like that. So that's a short summary of where we're at now. And yeah, look for this coming soon, TM. Costin.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've been, advocating from the beginning of the project. And I think, I don't know what's the relation with the mesh resource or APIs, because this is completely a protocol and, wire protocols definition and agreement, not anything else. Istio, for example, is moving to H1 protocol with HTTP to connect with some metadata. In the past, we use a crazy protocol. Other vendors have similar protocols that are specific to them. There is no way that Istio or other implementations that do MTLS or use protocols will be able to interoperate with each other unless we agree on a common protocol, in my opinion. And no API is going to solve this because at wire level, you cannot communicate. So maybe with plain text, we don't have the problem of MTLS and root certificates and all the others, but we still have the problem of how do we encapsulate metadata next to the TCP streams? How do we do all the other stuff that are protocol related? And if other vendors are open to adopt the RFCs around mask and HTTP to connect, then we can have at least a baseline and we can have all implementations at least interoperate with the base protocol, and then we can discuss negotiating, or if both implementation speaks the same things and then use a different protocol. But I really don't see any chance for interop between implementation without a common protocol. That's my.
Sorry, without a common, what was that?
Protocol. So on RFC, again, what we do in Istio now in Ambient with HTTP to connect, which is based on the IETF mask RFCs, is a starter. I mean, we are probably flexible in Istio as well. If someone finds a better protocol, probably we can implement it. But we need across vendors to define one protocol that we all support. That's otherwise we'll not be able to talk with each other.
Oh, okay. I get what you're talking about. I think that's like a step beyond the scope that I'm initially considering. Yes, I agree. We've done early explorations here years ago with some of the like Hamlet spec stuff too. But yeah, so I'm not intending to cover the actual like protocol specifics, more of like how L7 routing rules are applied and where those are applied, and things like configuration sync across clusters versus applying those like through a gateway of some sort when you're doing multi-cluster things. For namespaces, like routing, having like only consumer rules apply versus the like merge state of consumer and then producer rules. And same for gateway, like basically being mesh aware, and like respecting a gamma service configuration, and like any splits that may be configured at that level versus routing just to like the backend endpoints of the service. So that's kind of the scope. And yes, I think that's the like protocol thing is a step past that that we will hopefully get to at some point, but not in scope for this right now. Does that make sense?
Well, I don't see how, I mean, if we don't have the protocol, I don't know how we can test anything else. I mean, it's how is a conformance test or anything that is practical for users will work. But okay, I mean, any order we do at the end of the day, if we don't have the protocol, you'll not be able to have two mesh implementation in the same cluster set. Unless someone,
Yeah, I think to clarify, the scope that I'm focused on right now is within a single implementation. And when we get to multiple implementations or traffic between implementations, that's definitely going to be like one of the first building blocks, is kind of how to negotiate and do that.
I see. For single implementation, yeah, I agree. It's simple.
All right. Does anyone else have questions on this topic or anything else that we'd like to discuss? We have about 15 minutes left. And if not, I will wrap up early.
And Mike, I just want to confirm that the get that you're referring to, that really, it's focusing on kind of the interaction of ingress and mesh routing.
Yeah. Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes. And like mesh routing between namespaces, mesh routing between clusters in the cluster set. Basically trying to have a consistent behavior that like matches users' expectations for all of these different like boundary crossing type routing.
No, it makes sense. That's definitely important to solidify that.
Cool. Thanks. All right. Well, if there's nothing else we want to cover during this time, I'll wrap up 15 minutes early. Thank you very much, everyone, for taking time to join and be part of the conversation today. Take care and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.